Hey everyone, it is time for another recitation, this time going over how we use Redux Thunk with a random API. So all of you today for this project should have selected one of the uncountable number of public APIs on the internet and gotten data from it using Redux Thunk to put it in our state. And today I am just going to be revisiting the old the old API that we played with back in the day, which is the NASA photo of the day. I don't think any of you should have used this today, so hopefully you're all seeing something new. But I wanted to pick an API that had a pretty simple interface because I want most of our conversation to be about Redux, rather than like the API docs are weird or broken, or I'm getting CORS issues because they don't want you to make requests from front end. So I know this one works. So this is where we'll get it done. So over here I have my React project. It's just a create React app, and I added the dependencies that we're gonna need, which is gonna be Redux, React Redux, Redux Thunk, and Axios. And that's all started up. So why don't we open that up? And then we'll clean this thing out, because I hate the service worker and I hate the logo. So we will get rid of the service worker and we will get rid of the logo. Okay. So now we have our clear React project. NASA photo of the day. Why don't we put this in an H1? Alright, there we go, looking good. Looking good. Okay. So our first step here is to hook everything up to Redux. So I'm going to create some files and some directories. I'm going to create my reducers file. And I'm going to make an index.js in here. I'm going to declare my initial state. And I don't know what this is going to look like yet, so I'm just going to make it an object, because our state is always an object when we're using reducers. And then I'm going to declare my reducer function, which is going to take in state and use as a default argument the initial state, and then also take in an action. And we should set up our default switch, which is going to switch on action.type. And then our default case, we want to return state so that Redux will be able to pick up our initial state. And I'm going to export my reducer. So that's all you need to get your reducer defined and set up. To get it hooked up, we need to come into index.js. We're going to need to import create store from Redux. We're going to need to import provider from React Redux, because create store is unrelated to React. It just creates our store, which is, you know, a combination of our state and our reducer. But provider is like context. It's this React component that's going to give our data to our component tree where we need it. So we're going to create our store using create store. And we're going to pass it our reducer, which we also need to import. That's going to be in /reducers. And there's our store. And then we need to wrap our app in the provider. And get this all formatted nicely. And we need to give our store as a prop to the provider so that it can distribute that where it needs to go. Okay, so we're hooked up to Redux, but we need to be able to do these kind of asynchronous actions, which in our default Redux land there isn't a good method of doing, because our action creators just return an action and then that gets processed inside of our reducer. So if we make an Axios request, how do we return the value that is in our .then? And the answer is with the Redux Thunk middleware. So we're going to need to import that, and I have suddenly forgot what exactly the import statement on that looks like, if it's a named import or not. It is not. So we're going to import Thunk from Redux Thunk. And this is going to be the middleware that whenever one of our actions returns a function rather than an object, it will pass in the dispatch function to our Thunk, which a Thunk is a function that returns a function. So you kind of have to call it twice. It's like a weird conjugation of think. You can't think it, you have to like think it twice, so it's a Thunk.
Yeah, Henry. Regarding that, how would we compare like a thunk to a higher order function that takes in a function then returns a function?
Yeah, so our Thunk produces a higher order function. Not all Thunks necessarily take another function as an argument. A Thunk is a very kind of simple way of doing delayed evaluation. So like, let's say we have a very expensive operation we want to do. Like we want to calculate some really hard math stuff that's going to take our computer a while to do. And we potentially want to do it on like a big list of numbers, but only when the user clicks on each number. Well, one possibility is we can map over the list of numbers, and for each one we'll produce a function that when run will do the expensive calculation. But rather than just doing the expensive calculation in our map, we're creating this function that will do the calculation. And then when the user clicks on the button, we'll run that function and it'll do the expensive operation. So a thunk is a way of doing delayed execution by creating this kind of intermediary function. That's where that term comes from. And it is like a standard term. If you look for thunk, Redux Thunk comes up first. But yeah, it has a Wikipedia page. This is a programming concept that is used in other places. Yeah, so actually they're using my exact example. This is some expensive math calculation. If we don't want to do it right away, we can make a function that will do that, and then we will eventually evaluate that when it's needed. So a thunk is a way to do delayed evaluation. And that's what we're doing here. We're delaying the evaluation of our asynchronous function. We're getting in the dispatch function, and then we can use that to dispatch out stuff inside of our .then and .catch blocks inside of our asynchronous Axios request. Okay, so now that we have the thunk, we have to add it as middleware, because the middleware is going to get to inspect all of our actions before they get to our reducer. And we do that by importing apply middleware from Redux, and then we give as the second argument to create store, calling applied middleware on our middleware, in this case thunk. And we can add more middleware if we want. I'm not going to do that today. I'm not going to use Redux Logger, or not going to use Redux Logger or the Redux dev tools. I'm just going to keep it simple.
So if we need to apply multiple middlewares, would we just put it in the order that we want to apply them in the same argument, or call apply middleware multiple times?
They all go into the apply middleware.
Like, what if we wanted thunk as well as logger?
Yes, you can absolutely apply multiple middlewares. So that was the code that Dustin used to do the React Redux dev tools. I'm just curious. I don't know if the middleware applies them from left to right or not. So let's check the docs. So let's see. Is it going to give us an example? Yes, they do just go as multiple arguments and apply middleware, but I do not know the order in which they are applied, which usually won't matter. But we use compose when we are applying store enhancers, which is a slightly different kind of thing. Oh, and this is literally the compose function. That's interesting. Yeah. But if we're applying multiple middleware like logger and stuff, then we can do thunk logger, and that'll work. So I'm just doing one today, and we got our thunk. Okay. So then what we're gonna do is we are going to we're gonna get some data from our API, and we're gonna try to put it into our state. So first, let's try to figure out what our state is going to look like. It's going to be very simple. What do I want to call this? They call it apod. Why are they calling it apod? Oh, the astronomy picture of the day. Okay, so I'm going to call my key in here apod. And originally, I'm going to set it equal to null. Great. And when we get our data back from the API, this will be an object that contains the NASA photo of the day. That sounds good to me. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write my my action. So I'm going to create a directory called actions. I'm going to create a file called index.js. And I'm going to declare my action type, my types that we do whenever we're making API requests. So fetch apod, astronomy photo of the day, start, and this is going to be this, but in quotes, and this will make it easier to avoid typos. Then I'm going to do this, but replacing start with success, and then also replacing start with failure. And I have an extra bit of white space in here. Great. So now I can declare my action function, which I'm going to call get apod. And this needs to be equal to my arrow function. So I have my get apod function, and normally what we would do is we would return, type, fetch success or whatever, fetch start, but we're going to need to make an Axios request in here, right? And so if we do axios.get, and then inside of our .then we get the response, we can't return stuff out of here into the greater scope of our function. Right? This is why we've used things like useState and setState in order to create a side effect inside of our callback function here that's going to allow the outside world access to what is inside the body of this function. And we do this by leveraging the Thunk library, because instead of returning an object, we can return a function. And what the Thunk library will do for us that is very nice is it will give this function as an argument the dispatch function, which is going to allow us to, when we call this function and give it an action object as an argument, dispatch an action to go back into our queue to be processed by our reducer. So now suddenly we can call this inside of the .then in our Axios. We can call this inside of our asynchronous response. And then we can dispatch an action, whenever our request is finished. This looks a little wordy the way I've done it. Doing it the short way also looks kind of weird, but you're going to see this pattern, so I want to show it to you, where we have this function that inline in the implicit return style returns a function that accepts dispatch. and then we write the function body for that. And this is generally how we would write a Thunk or a curried function inside of JavaScript. Because the other way is just a little bit kind of wordy. Okay, so then here, what we want to do, we dispatch at the start of any of our API requests inside of Redux. We're going to dispatch an action with the type for our appropriate action type start. So I want to kick off that I have started my request, because that's going to allow me to set, you know, a loading thing inside of my state so that I can display my appropriate loading animation, which is a pretty cool feature of Redux. Because we can also, if we're firing off a bunch of requests, we can use the same loading variable and just, you know, keep it loading all the way through, which is kind of cool. And then I'm going to make my Axios request. So to do this, I'm going to need to import Axios from Axios. And then I'm going to make my GET request axios.get to the NASA API. And doing this is going to lead me on a brief tangent. Because this wants an API key, and I could use the demo key, but I'm guessing a lot of the APIs that you all ended up choosing today required you to use an API key. And the default thing that we want to do here is copy this API key, and then paste it in here, and then we're good to go. Right? Well, not quite. Because when I commit this code and push it onto GitHub, now my API key is just on GitHub for anyone to find. And it's not a big deal with a free API key because, you know, they're just going to use up my request allotment. But most of the time, when we have an API key, we have to pay for it, you know, if we're using an API seriously. And so then people could take this and make a bunch of requests, and suddenly we get a surprise bill. Or if we're working within a company, this API key might be like a secret, you know, that the users are not supposed to have access to. So what we can do to avoid checking this API key into source code is to use an environment variable, which I did once before, but I'm going to go over it again here. If you Google for this, there's a very nice page in the React docs about environment variables in React. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a file called .env.local. And we do this in the root of our project. So just right up here, I'm going to create a file called .env.local. And here I specify key value pairs of environment variables that I want to use in my app. They all have to be prefixed with React_app_. And so this is going to be a pod key. And then I'm going to set it equal to my API key, which was not that string. I'm going to go back and get that here. Also, there's my email address. And we do it in this exact format. No space after the equals sign. Quotes around a string. You don't technically need quotes, but it's better to be safe. And now I can restart my my yarn start in order for it to pick up this environment variable. And now I have access to this inside of my application using, not you localhost, get out of here, using process.env. So process.env will give us access to our environment variables for use within our application. So this is a way for us to provide data into our React applications without checking it into source code. So now I should be able to, inside of my actions file, instead of using my API key here, I can make this a template string, and I can insert process.env.react_app_apod key. And so it's going to get that value out of my environment variables. You can also set environment variables on Netlify and any other service that most likely you're going to be deploying to. There's an issue here though, which is that this key is still not exactly secret because it's going to end up in the code that runs in the user's browser, right? There's no way of avoiding that. In React, everything happens client-side, including this request. So if they dug around within the code that came with the request, they could find this key. Or they could just look in the network tab and see the requests going out. And we'll verify this once we get this working. And there's no solution around that. You can't hide secrets in a React application because ultimately everything is getting sent to the user. So there's no way for you to keep something from them forever. One of the workarounds is to have a proxy server. So you could have a backend server that you send a request to. And then that server will repeat the request with your API key in it, make it to the third-party service. Then when it gets the response back, it will send that response back to you. And this is exactly what all of the services that had cores no in that list wanted you to do. They don't want you to make a request from a front-end application because doing so requires you to use your key, and that's bad practice. So they blocked it using cores, which allows them to see that you're making this request from a website and not from a server and deny that request. So that's why we would need this proxy server in order to hide our secret key. For a project like this, it's totally fine for me to just use an environment variable because I'm not too concerned about people getting my key, but it's still a good idea to not check this into our source code. And I know I won't check it into my source code because there is a secret file that gets created when you run create React app called .gitignore. And this tells Git all the files to never commit. Notice how Git never asks you to commit node modules? It's because it's blacklisted within here. And if you were to do yarn install or npm install in the wrong directory and create node modules, and then it suddenly asks you to commit that, that's because your gitignore didn't block that out. But in your gitignore, environment.local is blocked out, so we never commit that to GitHub, which is good. So don't commit the env.whatever files to GitHub. Okay, so that aside, we now have our GET request going to our API with our API key that we've hidden inside of an environment variable that isn't really hidden. When we get back our response.data, we can now dispatch another event. This time, I want to dispatch an event with a type of fetch, let me get my autocomplete going, fetch apod success, and then I'm going to have the payload be my response data. However, if this fails, then I need a catch block. I'm going to receive an error, and I'm going to dispatch an event of type, come on autocomplete, fetch apod failure, and the payload is going to be error.response. And that'll give me access to the response object that Axios got, because the error that we're catching is a literal like JavaScript thrown error. But if we do error.response, we get the response object that Axios got. It's just going to be exactly like our response object on success, except the status code is going to start with either 4 or 500 rather than 200. So I can use that to investigate the error message I'm getting back from my server and then possibly display that to the user, which is very nice behavior. So now we have our asynchronous action creator set up so that we can utilize Redux Thunk to get this dispatch function to dispatch events within our then and catch asynchronous blocks. So, do we have any questions so far?
Yeah, Henry, regarding the env file,
Mm-hmm.
um, is it required to prepend with React app?
Yes, it is. And
Because we don't have to do that in Node.
yeah, so the reason that this is required is, for example, what if this, I decided to call this password, and then we end up deploying this on a system where we don't have an env local file that defines password. In that case, it will just use the global environment variable password, which what these environment variables are is, let me open up a terminal, is I've had a lot of you run this command before, echo $capital path. This is the environment variable path. And these are basically variables that our bash environment uses to cart information around. You have other ones, like browser, which has your default browser in it, and editor, which has your default editor in it. But we don't want to just be like getting environment variables willy-nilly out of systems, because they can be sensitive with the data that they contain. So React scripts, which is kind of the program that bundles together our create React app stuff for us, only will pull environment variables that begin with React _ app _. So we never get any of our normal users' environment variables that way. All right, any other questions here? So Eli asked, what's sent to GitHub when you use process.env? Would your deployment work since env.local is gone? So the deployment would not work if I deployed to somewhere like Netlify, because in the code that I've checked in, there is no environment variable defined. But on Netlify, you can define environment variables. And you can do that right through their web interface, where they will let you just straight up type in the key and value pair that you want to deploy. So it's in there somewhere. Yeah, environment variables. And there's a whole way of adding these on Netlify and on Heroku and on most other services that you'll be deploying to. So there you go. All right. Any other questions with this? Okay. Well, let's try to get this actually hooked up. So what we're going to do is we are going to connect our app.js to Redux. So we're going to import connect. I'm all over the place today. From React Redux, and then we're going to connect app to Redux. And I'm just going to do this all within this single component, because just trying to make this a simple application today. So we need to provide two arguments to connect: our map state to props, and then any action functions that we want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define my map state to props, and this is going to take in my state, and then I'm going to return an object that contains all the stuff that I want. This morning I was lazy, and I just gave back the whole state variable. We'll just be a little bit more judicious here. So I'm going to give it apod, and this is going to be from state.apod. We'll add an error in here too. This will be an empty string to start. We'll have loading, and this will be set to false initially. And we'll add those here too. So error is going to be state.error, and loading is going to be state.loading. And this is normally the way we'll have our map state to props work. Now if I accept props inside of app and console.log props, we should see those coming through from our initial state. So let's check our dev console, which we should almost always have open anyway. And let's refresh the page. Aha. we don't have those props. Why don't I have those props? Let's see. So we have our reducer set up. It's going to return state by default. Let's see. We provided everything correctly, right? Let's check our index. We did create store. We applied our middleware of Thunk, and then I provided the store. I probably just made a little goof somewhere. If anyone sees it, please let me know. Because setting this.
Yeah, you're not connecting the map state to props, are you?
Gosh, I always
Yeah,
do this. I always do this. I write my map state to props. I write my handle change function, and then I don't give it to the actual thing that needs it. Ugh, the fun, the joys of live coding. Okay, so now our props are coming through from state. Awesome. So now what we want to do is we want to start displaying the data from our server. So I'm going to add a button called Get Photo of the Day. And what we're going to do is we're going to check if the photo of the day is defined. Then I want to display a div. I'm sorry, this should be props dot our photo of the day. I'm going to display a div that contains, let's format this a little bit nicer. Let's add an image tag, and the source is going to be props.apod. And we'll have to look at what our API is given back. So that's going to be at URL. And then we'll also have a paragraph tag with props.apod.explanation. That should be good enough. Since that didn't show up, that means that apod isn't defined, which is correct because in my initial state, inside of my reducer file, apod is additionally null, which is why I set it like that. I'm also going to, if the error exists, so if props.error does not equal an empty string, then I'm going to have a p tag that displays the error. But I'm going to hold off on this because we're going to have to take a look at the format that the error gets back in and how we want to handle all of that. And then if we're loading, we'll just have a simple loading message. So if loading is defined, then I'll have a div that says loading. And we'll replace this with an SVG spinner in just a minute because I think that's going to be neat. Okay, so we have our app.js roughly set up to get these things to work. Now we need to hook up our action to our app so that we can trigger it when we press on this button. So to do this, we're going to have to import our action, which probably means I'm going to have to export it because I guarantee I forgot. Yep, these all need to be exported. And this needs to be exported as well. And now I can import getApod from my /actions. Now I can't go and call this directly because I'm not going to get any error, and I'm going to stare at this for like 20 minutes and go like, why isn't this working? It's because we have to give it to this second argument in connect so that it can hook it up to our Redux store, and then it will actually dispatch the action to our reducer. If we called it directly, then we'd just be calling a function that returns a function and doesn't do anything else. So we have to pass it through connect. Otherwise it does nothing. So I'm going to hook this up to our button. So on click, I want to call my props.get my astronomy photo of the day. So if I click this, nothing happens. That's because I haven't set up my reducer yet. I can verify in here with a console.log that we are actually firing this event when we click this button. Yep, we are firing it. And we can verify that we're getting data back from the server with another console log in here. Yep, so here is our response object that we're getting back from the server. That contains all of our good data in there. But I want to actually put this in my state. So I need to write the handlers inside of my reducer to handle these different actions. So let's jump over to our reducer file and let's handle these. So I'm going to do case, and to avoid having to type out a very long string, and as you write Redux applications, these get very, very, very long, we get to import these nice types that we had defined here. So I'm going to import with a named import fetch apod start, fetch, come on, autocomplete, fetch apod success, and fetch apod failure. And this is going to be from ... because I'm in the reducers folder, so I need to go up and then back into actions. And we might as well format this just a smidge nicer. Okay. So now I have my different types, so I can write my cases for them. I'm going to write the case for fetch apod start first, because it's a good place to start. And I will always want to return my modified state variable. And in here, all I want to do is clear out my error and set loading to be true. So we reset any error we had on the last request, and then we also specify that we're loading. I'm then going to handle my success case. And here, I'm also going to clear out the error. I did this on start, so it isn't necessarily needed, but I'm going to keep it here for safekeeping. And also, what if I jam on this button and fire a bunch of different requests, and they fire out of order, and some of them fail and some of them pass? I might as well just clear out the error on success to be safe. I'm going to set loading to be false, and then I'm also going to set my apod to be the action.payload, because that is going to be the res.data object that I'm getting back from my API. Finally, I want to handle the failure case. And here, I'm going to set loading to be false as well. I'm going to leave the apod alone. Actually, I'm going to set it to be null. So that if we had one that was successfully displayed and we tried to display a new one, we're going to clear out that old one. And then I'm going to set this error to be the action.payload. And we're going to learn the shape of this in a minute, and we're going to have to kind of massage some values out of this in order to get it to work.
Quick question, Henry.
Yeah.
Why are we importing the action variables into the reducer?
Yeah, so this is because we need to use cases that switch off of these, right? And these are going to be long strings that are very easy to mistype. So we define them as variables inside of our action file so that, one, our text editor can do autocomplete, so that when I start typing fetch _ apod, you can just autocomplete it. But two, we're going to get errors if we misspell this because this variable won't be defined. So it just gives us kind of another source of reassurance that we're typing these things correctly. You can absolutely just use straight strings, but this gives us reassurance that we are using the right thing.
I mean, you could just like redeclare the variables in the reducer, right? You don't have to import it.
You could, but then you have two places where you could potentially misspell the value of this variable. So the default behavior inside of Redux projects is to declare these within our actions file and then import them into our reducer. And that's going to be the pattern that you see out in the wild.
I see. Okay.
And it looks like Carlos asked a question a minute again. At this point, how do we know if we need a class component? I'm not sure how to intuitively feel of whether I would need state or not, especially with map state to props. So we never need a class component anymore. We never need a class component. In old React, the only way we could have state inside of a component was with a class component. Functional components didn't have state. But since the release of hooks, we can have state inside of a functional component. And anything we could do in a class-based component, we can now do inside of a functional component. So we never need a class component. And honestly, there's not much of a reason to write one if you're comfortable with hooks. The reason to know class-based components is because legacy code written before hooks was available, or by developers who haven't learned hooks yet, you're going to need to be able to understand. You should be writing some class-based components as we do these projects just to get practice in, but you never need to write one from a technical perspective in modern React. Okay, do we have any other questions at this point?
Just for quickly, so I have a better understanding.
Mm-hmm.
You have an easier way to explain it of exactly what actions and reducers are exactly?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a exact question.
So I think I have a drawing that I made earlier actually, and I'll draw it again. I just sent it to the wrong spot. That needs to go here. Okay, so let me delete this drawing. Get out of here. Okay. So what actions and reducers are is we can think of our actions as messengers. So what an action creator does is it dispatches an action, right? That's the terminology we've been using. That's what we've been calling the functions that do dispatch inside of our useReducer hook and also using Redux Thunk. But what they're basically doing is they're sending a message. And what we can think of behind the scenes in Redux is there being this big array that is this like queue. I actually want to reverse this. Okay, let me write my action over here. So we have our action creator. And what this is going to do is it's going to push a message onto this queue, which is this big array that contains action objects. And this has a type in it, and this is like, you know, create thing. And there's more of these. We have, you know, more actions on this queue, like fetch, start, and so on and so forth. And these are just messages where we're asking for something to happen. Fetch success. We're not actually doing anything to our state here. We're just saying, hey, I want you to do something. I want you to mark this as completed. I want you to increase this number. I want you to remove this element from a list. We're just asking for something to happen. This is a message. Then on the other end of this queue of messages is our reducer. And it's going to pick these off one by one and pass them through our reducer. And this is why we call it a reducer, is because it has the function signature of the callback function to reduce. It has the accumulator value, which is our state, and then it takes each value off of this array, which is one of these action objects. And what our reducer does is it returns the new value for state. And so what we have here is action creators. The functions that we run are all very simple. They just ask for something to happen. And then the logic for making that happen happens inside of our reducer when they pull this message off of this queue. So this is how our Redux works. Our action creators make messages. These messages are read by our reducer, which then produces the state, based on what the message asked our reducer to do. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, cool. Any other questions at this point? We're still kind of in this nebulous phase. I know what I always say is I want to get stuff on my screen as fast as possible, but with Redux it can be hard to do that because there's a lot of scaffolding to put in place before things can happen. And that can make it frustrating to work with. But once you get the hang of it, it really isn't too bad. And on large projects, it can help a lot. This isn't a large project, so we put up all this scaffolding to do something that normally we could do very easily, but it's good to practice. And it's certainly easier than making a large project to warrant the use of Redux. So, now we have our reducer that's going to be able to handle start, going to be able to handle our success case, and going to be able to handle our failure case. So now, before I do this, I want to add my traditional reducer console.log for my action so that I can see that actions are being dispatched and read by my reducer. And so when I click get photo of the day, I dispatch this action. We see that we are doing the start action, and then the new props that come into my app is going to be loading's true, apod is still null, the error is cleared out, and then on success, we're going to see that loading is false, our apod is now the object full of the data that we see on our screen, and we're good to go. Let's test out our error version by adding a fake date to it. That's not a date. And I'm going to add into my error case a console.log of error and then also error.response. What did I do here that it does not like? Oh, this should go here. And that should go there. Okay. So I'm going to add a console.log of error and error.response. So when I click on this, we're going to try to request a date that doesn't exist from our API, which should send us an error back. And when I console log the error, I get this like very special JavaScript error object. But when I do error.response, which is what we see right here, this is just a response object. It's got a status, it's got data, it's got the other information that we largely ignore. And if we look inside of data, we see that it has an error, and then this error has a message, which is an error saying that the API key is invalid because I did my date format wrong. This needs to be an ampersand when we supply multiple query parameters. But that's what our error looks like. And this will trigger another error, and we can see inside the error, we're now getting a status of 400, bad request. Inside the data, we see the code, and then a message, the data does not match this format. So that's what I'm going to use as our error. So our payload, instead of being error.response, is going to be error.response.data.message. And then in here, we set our error to be the action.payload, which is going to be that error message. And then that's going to show up as our error. So then in app, I can uncomment this. And in the case that there is an error, the error does not equal this empty string, then I want to display a paragraph that shows our error. So we see the loading for a second, and then we see our error message. This is going to be the basic setup for handling any API request using Redux Thunk. We write our reducer to handle the start, success, and failure cases, and we write our action that is going to dispatch the start, the success, and the failure cases inside of the beginning of the function, and then inside of the .then, which is going to contain the successful data, and inside of the .catch, which is going to contain the unsuccessful data. So there we go. All right, questions here. We're going to keep going. We're going to get an input in order to put that date in there. All right. Any questions? No? This all seemed good?
No, but I say thank you, Henry. It was
Okay.
awesome.
Great. So I want to get an input that will allow me to type a date and then make a request from the server using that date. Just because it's neat and I want to do it. So what I'm going to do is inside of app.js, I'm going to add an input. And it's going to be self-closing. An input type is going to be text. Placeholder is going to be date. And even though I'm using Redux, it is allowable for me to have local state in this component, which I think is kind of, Carlos, what you were getting at with your question of when I'm using Redux, when do I have state inside of my components? And we can still use a functional component for this. But the idea of when our components have local state is things like a form, where in order to get this specific component working, it needs state. And that's fine, but no other component inside of my application really needs access to it. We're going to be able to give access to it by calling a function, but our component is still allowed to have local state. So I'm going to import useState from React. I'm going to make a useState const date and setDate. And I'm going to set this equal to useState. That's going to be an empty string. And I spelled it incorrectly in my import. I've been kind of all over the place tonight. I apologize for that. So then I'm going to set the value on my input to be date. And then I'm going to just write an inline onChange handler, which is going to take in the event, and this is going to set date to be the event.target.value. And let's format this just a smidge nicer, because while zoomed in, I have so few characters until I start overflowing over the side. So now I have an input that I can type into, and that works. And I'm going to add an argument to props.getApod. What I'm going to do is when we click on this button, I'm going to give it the value of my date. And right now, if I look at my props.apod, or not my props.apod, the getApod function, I don't accept an argument. So I'm going to add one called date. And this is going to be whatever date that I have written in there. So in order to make use of this, we're going to have to write a tricky little bit of code. Because if we look at the API docs for NASA, if we want to add a date, we add it as a query parameter, which is, I didn't mean to click on this, which is what we're doing here when we do question mark API key equals. That's a query parameter. So we need to add another one for date. So what we can do is we can do ampersand, which is how we separate multiple query parameters. The first one begins with this question mark here. The rest of them begin with an ampersand. Date is going to equal date. The problem is, what if I don't have a date? What if I just want to get today's? What if I haven't typed anything into that box? And the solution is we can get really tricky in here. So what I can do is I can write a ternary in here. If date is not equal to an empty string, then what I want to return is the string ampersand date equals plus the date variable, and otherwise I just want to give back an empty string. So we'll only have this parameter ampersand date equals in the case where the user has typed something into the date input and given it as the argument to get apod. And now in here I have it set up so that I have my date stored within this variable, and then when we call get apod, we're giving it as the argument. So theoretically, if I've done this right, if I click get photo of the day, it will get today's. If I type some random garbage in here, we get the error saying that this does not match our date format. But if we type in some good date, which has to be in year, 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 dash, month, month, dash, day, day, aw, I can't get my birthday. Let's do my birthday in 1999. Yay, there we go. So now we've hooked up this nice little input to our API, and we can get whatever day that we want. All right, so do we have any questions here? All right, I see Sean typing. Sean asked a question, how do you not work at Apple or something? So I actually do want to talk about this, which is I struggled through all of this too. I know that today it hasn't been my cleanest explanation, but I know sometimes I'm able to explain these things, you know, really clearly. But like when I learned Redux, it was hard because Redux is hard. I am no superhuman genius. Like I struggled through this too. And what these sessions are born out of is something that I had wanted when I was here, was when I'd finish a project, even if I hit MVP, I had lots of questions. Did I do this the right way? Are there other ways of doing this? Is there something I should be connecting here to what we've learned in the past that I'm not really seeing? And so that's why, like this week, I really wanted to talk about the pattern of like dumb components and separating our state management from the props that we're passing our components. That way, as we suddenly switch through these different state management solutions, we can reuse the same kind of component logic we've been doing. We can learn from that. And I learned from that. And doing these sessions has allowed me to learn so much. Oftentimes when I'm talking, in my head, I'm like, oh wow, I just figured this out. This makes so much more sense now that I'm doing this project the second time. So I want you all to know that I was where you were just a few short months ago. So you're in good company. And one of the great parts of being a TL is that you get to go back and redo all of this stuff again, but this time with the knowledge of the entire full stack course with you. And you're going to get to be a lot more successful and feel a lot more smart because like when you do the starting JavaScript stuff, you're going to be like, oh, I see why they teach it like this. It's because we do it like this in React and like this is the parallel here. Or when you do prototypical inheritance, you're going to be like, it's just an object. Like it's just a key on an object. And you're going to get to see all these patterns that before you were, you know, blinded from seeing because you were just trying to figure out how to get it to work. If you could just get the error to go away, that's all you need. So I want you to know that I contain no mystic knowledge other than going through this program. Priyanka asked, how difficult is it to make a random date generator and pass that date to the query? With this date format, it wouldn't be too hard at all. What you could do is use math.random, JS math random. I'm going to pull up the MDN page for this. So this is a function that returns a number between 0 and 1 pseudo-randomly. And they show here this neat little function to get a random integer up to a maximum range. And you could also specify a minimum by doing something like min and then plus min. And what this is going to do is allow you to get a random integer between two different sets of values. So then for our year, we could go, they had a date range for us. I think it was 1995 to the current year. So we could go 1995 to 2019. For the month, 1 to 12. You know, for the day in the month, that's where it gets tricky because the days in the months are different. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know how many days are in any month of the year. None. No clue. No clue. I'll never learn it either. It's just something that I've gone this far without knowing, and I'll never know. So that would be the tricky bit, but you could, you know, store these in, you know, some kind of object that maps the month number to the number of days in that month. You'd have to look that up because I can't tell you. The issue would be how to get the trailing 0 onto the start of your random month and day if it's less than 10. And JavaScript has got you covered with this pad start function that you can use on strings to pad zeros onto the beginning. So this string, I always want to be at least 2 characters in length, and if it is not, add zeros onto the front until it is. So the output is 05. If we made this 3, then it would be 005. If it was 2, but our string was 15, then the output would just be 15. So that would be your random date generator. All right, and I see Dennis typing. All right, well, thank you, Dennis. That is very kind of you. In Build Week, I'll be doing, you know, similar kind of pop-up sessions like I did last Build Week, where I just talk about topics that I think are going to be helpful. And I remember thinking of a very good idea for this upcoming Build Week, but I forgot it. So, oops. I'm sure I'll think of it again. But yeah, do we have any final questions to close us out? I have encroached into after hours time, and I feel bad about that. Alright, I see Greg typing. Yes, this video will be uploaded as soon as I am done. So, if there are no longer any questions, I will bid you all adieu. Alright, and a couple people are typing. It may just be thank yous, but if there are questions, I want to get them in the video. Alright, tips for getting used to all the JS syntax. JavaScript is a super syntaxy language. Lots of different ways to write things. Like, just think about how many different ways we have to define functions. It's a lot. I would say practice, read other code. I've given this out a couple times today, but Eloquent.js is a good online textbook going over all of this JavaScript stuff. Just doing like a little bit of this every day and just exposing yourself to this plain syntax every single day is good. You got to repeat this stuff. You're learning a language here. Got to practice every day. But I promise over time, I mean, just straight up is an act of radical self-care, as the kids are saying these days. Please look at this block of code and then imagine you from 3 months ago looking at this code, right? Right when you started Lambda. Oh boy, would you have no idea what is happening here. And you might not feel entirely comfortable with this now, but if you take the time, you can understand everything that is happening here. And this is dense and crazy, and there's curly braces everywhere, and they mean different things in every place, and there's dots and things and arrows, and it's monstrous. So please pat yourself on the back. You have come so far in such a short amount of time. It is nothing short of miraculous. So I think that'll close us out for tonight. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you all next week.